Hello everyone, and welcome to the first in this year's series of BCLT Research Seminars in Literary Translation. My name is Duncan Large, and I am the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, which is based in the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. Usually we would be meeting on campus, but in these highly unusual circumstances, we decided to hold the seminar online for the first time this year. The downside is that I'm afraid we can't all have a glass of wine over questions at the end of the paper, but that is more than compensated by the ability to open our events up to a far wider and more numerous audience than ever. So I'm delighted that we're being joined live this afternoon by many people who would not otherwise be able to be in Norwich or even in the UK. Welcome all. If you haven't joined us for an event before and would like to find out more about the British Centre for Literary Translation, please check us out on the web, bclt.org.uk, where you'll find details of all our activities, including the other 3 research seminars in this term's series. It's my great pleasure now to introduce today's speaker, Franca Cavagnoli. I first met Franca in 2016 when we shared a session at the Babel Festival in London, and I was delighted to work with her again at this year's online European School for Literary Translation. Franca Cavagnoli is a translator, novelist, and academic based in Milan, where she shares her time between the university and the School of Interpreters and Translators. She's published 3 novels in Italian, the first of which, Una pioggia bruciante, 2000, was awarded the Cuneo First Novel Prize. This was followed in 2007 by Non si è seri a 17 anni, and in 2015 by Luminosa. She's published 2 short story collections with Feltrinelli, Mbakanga 2013 and Black 2014. As a scholar of English language literature, Franca Cavagnoli has, among her other projects, edited 2 translated collections of Australian short stories and the complete short stories of Catherine Mansfield. Her own many translations from English into Italian include works by William S. Burroughs, J.M. Coetzee, Nadine Gordimer, James Joyce, Jamaica Kincaid, David Malouf, Toni Morrison, V.S. Naipaul, and Mark Twain. Her new Italian version of The Great Gatsby won the Gregor von Rezzori Prize in 2011. Her 2012 book on translation theory and practice, La Voce del Testo, was awarded the Lo Straniero Prize, and in 2014 she received the National Translation Prize of Italy. Further details are available on Franca's website, which handily is simply francacavagnoli.com. Talking of online, let me just give you a few housekeeping tips for this session. First, we are recording today's seminar and we'll be making it available afterwards on the BCLT's YouTube channel. Can I ask you please to make sure your camera is turned off and your mic muted so that the sound quality is not impaired. You can select speaker view so that you can see only one screen at a time. Please feel free to ask questions via the chat function, and I'll put them to Franca on your behalf at the end of her paper. One final point, Franca has prepared a handout for this session, which we put up on the BCLT website, and there was a link in the Eventbrite invitation. But in case you haven't already got it, I'll put a link in the chat just now. Without further ado then, let me hand over now to Franca Cavagnoli for her paper, Cultural Hybridity and Liminal Space in Postcolonial Literary Translation. Franca.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much, Duncan, for this lovely presentation. I would like to thank you for inviting me here, and also thank the British Centre for Literary Translation and the University of East Anglia for this invitation. great honor to be here. I'm very glad. Although I'm not there, I'm, how can I say, sympathetically there. I really would like to be not only virtually there. And it's not just, I'm not saying it just for the sake of saying it, but because it's, I have really developed, because of the founder of the British Centre for Literary Translation, for Sebald. It's a place I feel very near. Sebald was, and still is, one of my favorite writers, and so it's really an honor, and I can use the word, I think. I'm touched, I'm moved by the fact of being virtually here with you. Okay, let's start now. Liminal space has been scarcely explored by translation studies in Italy. Many scholars find it hard enough to accept the concept of translation studies as an interdisciplinary field, and often prefer to focus on just one of the many aspects of translation studies, rather than take into consideration the many facets, linguistic, literary, cultural, semiotic, and philosophical as a whole. But the interdiscipline of translation studies requires, in the words of Basnet and Trivedi, a new politics of in-betweenness for a reassessment of the creative potentialities of liminal space. The Translation Act involves so much more than language, and translations are encased in history, culture, ideology, and politics. As for the publishing world, for the publishing industry, translations have traditionally been considered above all for their aesthetic value in Italy. Hence, aesthetics is the aspect which publishers would require translators to focus on. La traduzione deve essere bella. Your translation must be beautiful. That's what they usually say. Here, the very concept of aesthetic value boils down essentially to tidiness, order, and morphosyntactic and lexical propriety. Instead of respecting the properties of the other, thanks to an appropriate translation, what happens often is that the source text's properties are distorted through appropriating rewriting. I would like to clarify what I mean by appropriate translation and appropriating translation. The former is, in my view, a translation that respects the properties of the other, that is, the peculiar qualities, the inherent qualities of the other. When rewriting the other's text in one's own language, one will welcome the foreign elements of the other culture and any deviations from the standard language, the text's unique features, the stylistic peculiarities. An appropriating translation, on the other hand, is a translation that manipulates and distorts the text and represses innovation, as Lefebvre would say, and makes the other equal to the self. In fact, the concept of translation as a place which cultural and historical differences must be preserved is one they would find, and often still find, difficult to accept. And the time has come now to approach translation with a broader view in Italy too, and to consider all the linguistic, literary, cultural, historical, semiotic, philosophical, ideological and political implications of the Translation Act. A publishing house's refusal to publish a translation because it is too innovative, according to them, and thus fails to meet the publishing house's traditional policy in matter of translation, is to be considered an act of censorship established by the publisher's own ideology. The in-between space is a culturally fertile ground for postcolonial translation. Let us bear in mind that, and I quote from Homi Bhabha, it is the cutting edge of translation and renegotiation, the in-between space, that carries the burden of the meaning of culture. Many post-colonial writers find it difficult to define their own culture, since outlines are blurred and transcend traditional categories. The culture of many post-colonial writers is a complex fabric resulting from the juxtaposition and combination of diverse elements, which are often antithetic and bring to the surface contradictions and ambiguities. The adjective that best defines this type of culture, hybrid, is also ambiguous. Look up the word in any Italian dictionary and you will see the negative connotation that accompanies its definition. The nouns juxtaposition and combination are most often accompanied by the adjectives arbitrary and incongruous. The emphasis is placed on the presence of elements that fail to match, almost as if they were ill-assorted, when in fact it would be sufficient to set aside every bias and simply highlight the diversity and plurality of the composition of that which is hybrid, and therefore its great richness. In his seminal essay, The Location of Culture, Bhabha introduces the concept of third space, the scope of which is not based, and I quote, on the exoticism of multiculturalism or the diversity of cultures, but on the inscription and articulation of culture's hybridity, end of quote. When hybridity is expressed in a new linguistic situation, such as that represented by contact languages, the difficulty of coming to terms with such a fleeting reality is bound to skyrocket. That is why it is important to investigate the area where two or more languages and two or more cultures come together and blend and overlap, where their distinctive traits are blurred by the process of superimposition. It is the zone which Bartoloni, quoting Gasparini, calls interstitial, the zone in which source and target cultures melt and generate a culture underway, which resembles, yet is also markedly different from them. The interesting thing about the interstitial zone is the foreign element that reveals the interstitial in Homi Bhabha's words, and therefore its ability to create something new, the ability of the foreign element to create something new. It is these two elements, the foreign and the new, that enable the translator to challenge the cultural values of the publishing establishment. Pidgins and creoles move fluidly through this interstitial area that lies in the midway. Indeed, contact languages represent an area in which translators, revisers, and editors can break new ground in the creative potential of liminal space. Pidgins and creoles develop in a contact zone, that is, in Pratt's words, the space of colonial encounters, the space in which people geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of coercion, radical inequality, and intractable conflict, end of quote. The tendency in Italy has been traditionally to ignore pidgins and creoles in translation. The dialogues in these languages being translated into standard Italian as if they had been written in standard English. Or, and this is just the flip side of the same question, they have been considered as wrong versions of other languages, as second-class versions of noble European languages. Pidgin has long been labeled as broken English, coolie language, cookhouse lingo, but in fact is a new language. If a lingua franca is a language formed by a mixed vocabulary and very simplified grammar, used as a means of communication between people who have no other language in common, then Pidgin is a lingua franca born for practical reasons of communication in areas where different linguistic groups came into contact, such as ports and forts in Africa during slavery. It is spoken as a second language and not as a mother tongue, and is characterized by morphological and syntactical simplification and by a limited vocabulary. When a community gives up its own language and takes up Pidgin as a mother tongue, Pidgin turns into Creole, as in Jamaica, for example. The assessment of Pidgin and Creoles as mere representations of bad grammar use has engendered Italian translations that are often full of bad mistakes and awkward sentences. The result of such an attitude is the ridiculing of the characters speaking Pidgins or Creoles. Among Antoine Berman's deforming tendencies, which translators can fall for, there are two which are similar for the problems they pose. On the one hand, there is the 10th tendency, that is the destruction of vernacular networks or their exoticization. On the other hand, there is the 12th tendency, that is the effacement of the superimposition, the overlapping of languages in the same text. In Italy, translators tend to ignore the presence of dialects and vernaculars in a novel and just translate dialogues in standard Italian, prompted by the publishers in this, of course. Sometimes translators or revisers stress the presence of dialects and vernaculars, writing entire dialogues in italics and adding therefore an emphasis which is not present in the source text. A line or entire dialogues are translated into standard Italian and then written in italics, an expedient that tends to exoticize the text and disorient the reader, who wonders why the line or entire dialogues are in italics. Another exoticizing tendency, the most deplorable in my opinion, is to create an artificial language or artificial dialect. This is fake. It is diametrically opposed to the spontaneity given by the use of vernacular. Translators or revisers who make this choice tend to overemphasize, to translate on the basis of cliches and stereotypes. Another possibility is exoticization coupled with vulgarization, when the translator chooses to translate the variety of English spoken in Glasgow, for instance, with the popular language spoken in Naples or Rome. That vernaculars are deeply rooted in their soil and resist any direct translation into another vernacular. Translation can occur only between cultivated languages, says Antoine Bermond. An exoticization that turns the foreign from abroad into the foreign at home winds up merely ridiculing the original. The other deforming tendency, that is the effacement of the superimposition, the overlapping of languages in the same text, is particularly dangerous for postcolonial translation. In many postcolonial novels and short stories, there are two distinct linguistic and cultural levels: the English of the mother country and one or more locally spoken Englishes. The first is written with a capital E, English, and Englishes, of course, is not with a capital letter. The relationship between English and Englishes has caused tension and conflicts among colonized peoples of the British Empire. And the coexistence of these distinct linguistic and cultural levels is not easy. In these cases, the translation act may damage the overlapping of linguistic varieties and compromise the integrity of the text. The tension between the refusal of English and the will to appropriate it by postcolonial authors risks to be overlooked in the translated text, and one does not feel the pressure coming from beneath intending to subvert English. The difference between varieties of the same language, or the difference between the surface language and the language underneath, usually the postcolonial writer's mother tongue, tends to be cancelled out in translation, and the translated text is often homogeneous without any trace of the complex original linguistic and cultural texture. Indeed, one of the greatest risks is run by contact languages, and more in general by artistic creations that transcend traditional categories. The reasons are manifold. Sometimes translators and revisers are not sufficiently familiar with the genesis of these languages and the complex cultural contexts they originate from. Therefore, when they come across a line in Pidgin or Creole, they simply write it off as poor grammar. Other times it is the translators or the revisers' dormant classism or racism, or even their paternalism, that horns in on the translation process and leads to the stereotyped rendering of characters and situations. Again, it may be simply because of carelessness or failure to read into the text that the translator or the reviser fails to capture the specific cultural reality of a given character. In Sozaboy, a novel in rotten English, published in 1985, the book on the civil war that tore Nigeria asunder in the late 60s, Ken Saro-Wiwa works on 3 linguistic levels, as he specifies in his introduction to his novel. And these 3 linguistic levels are Nigerian Pidgin English, simply broken English, and occasional flashes of good, even idiomatic English in Saro-Wiwa's words. The protagonist is a young soldier of the Nigerian army who never completed his education, a sort of African Huckleberry Finn, and the writer creates for him a linguistic pastiche he calls rotten English. It's Saro-Wiwa's definition, rotten English. The rot of a society in total chaos, at the mercy of corrupt politicians and torn asunder by a bitter civil war, is reflected by the young soldier's rotten language. The book famously opens as follows, and this is the first of our examples, just one line. Although everybody in Jukana was happy at first. The use of although strikes us immediately. We expect the sentence to continue, not to run into a comma. We are surprised by the absence of a follow-up to although, an absence that pushes one to speculate. Although life was difficult, although the situation was not easy, and so on. We might even take the comma for a misprint and read the sentence as, although everybody in Jukana was happy at first, as if it were a dependent clause leading up to the main clause. In this case, finding a full stop, we could assume that the speaker has much to tell, but isn't used to telling, and therefore his sentence is broken. Or maybe his command of the language is weak. If although were followed not by a comma, but by pause dots, we could give the sentence an adversative interpretation, a sort of and yet, as it were, intended to plunge the reader right into the middle of the story. The sheer semantic richness of that although followed by a comma makes Saro-Wiwa's text a very open text. The presence of this contradictory element is surprising, much like the opening of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and I quote, "You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, that ain't no matter." Again, without in place of unless, without you read, says Huck. Without in place of unless takes us by surprise and immediately tells us something very specific about Huck's language. And as we read on, our impression will be confirmed. This is not a novel in standard literary English. In fact, all we need to do to regain our bearings is to read on a few more pages, going back not to Huck, but to Mene and to Sozaboy. And this is the second example, example number 2. So, although everyone was happy at first, after some time, everything began to spoil small by small, and they were saying that trouble had started. The comma regains its standard position in the sentence, and the mystery is solved. What we still do not know is the reason behind the opening sentence. And pages upon pages could be written on the subject as hinted by my previous conjectures. But what the translator is concerned with is that the sentence is anomalous, and therefore it must be, please forgive me for my normativeness, if I'm normative, since the sentence is anomalous, it must be rendered as such in the Italian edition as well. Instead, the existing Italian edition poses no surprise for the reader, since the opening has been standardized. If we now look at the Italian, we read comunque all'inizio tutti erano contenti a Ducana. The Italian sentence bears no anomaly, nor do we feel something is missing. And it seems that the sentence is completely untied from the clarifying sentence a few pages on, the translation of example number 2. Così, sebbene all'inizio tutti erano contenti, dopo un po' di tempo tutto prese pian piano a sputtanarsi e così dissero che era cominciato proprio un gran casino. The effect on the Italian reader would be much different, I think, if the opening were malgrado, comma, all'inizio tutti erano contenti a Ducana. After malgrado, one would expect the sentence to continue. The same would happen with benché or sebbene, two of the most common Italian renderings of although. This way, the estrangement of the English sentence would be recreated to the benefit of the Italian reader. And in the other sentence, the same clarifying effect could be achieved as in the source text by picking up from the first sentence and completing it. Così, malgrado che all'inizio tutti erano contenti, dopo un po' le cose, poco alla volta, prendono ad andare a male e tutti dicevano che erano cominciati i casini. The young protagonist's language, that unique amalgam of diverse elements defined by Saro-Wiwa as rotten English, is in some points rendered very well in the so-called official translation, in the published translation, as shown by the disregard of the subjunctive mood in favor of the indicative mood, sebbene all'inizio tutti erano contenti, and the use of a typically youthful vocabulary, sputtanarsi, un gran casino. Nevertheless, the use of the passato remoto, past simple, the literary tense par excellence in Italian, makes the young soldier's language sound contrived, when in fact he tells his tale skipping back and forth between present and past. Everyone was happy at first, everything began to spoil, they were saying. Maybe also because he forgets in his excitement to tell his story that the past of begin is began, and he even forgets to conjugate the verb. The narrator's jump to the present can also be read as a stronger presence in his mind of what is spoiled now as compared to the collective happiness of the past. Preserving this element in the Italian translation would make the reader aware of an important aspect of the narrator's psychology. Finally, the reflexive intransitive verb sputtanarsi is commonly used to indicate a person who exposes themselves to everyone's scorn by committing something ridiculous or disgraceful, si è sputtanato, si è sputtanata. Whereas the verb spoil in the original text refers to everything and not to somebody. We have a third example taken from Sozaboy, where Saro-Wiwa gives an evocative description of the villages as they celebrate the fall of the government. All the 9 villages were dancing, and we were eating plenty maize with pear and nakintori under the moon, because the work on the farm had finished and the yams were growing well, and because the old bad government have dead and the new government of Soza and police have come. The Italian translation reads as follows: tutti I 9 villaggi danzavano e mangiavano un sacco di mais con le pere, snocciolando racconti sotto la luna, perché il lavoro dei campi era finito e l'igname stava crescendo proprio bene, e perché il vecchio governo cattivo era morto ed era arrivato un nuovo governo, un governo di sosa soldati e di polizia. In this section, the author uses the Nigerian pidgin word soza, which, as we can see from the glossary at the end of the novel, is the abbreviation of Soza man, soldier. An English-speaking reader will feel estranged reading the word Soza, but then they may turn to the glossary for help. Soza, army, in the glossary. Soza is explained as army. The translation of Soza in the glossary is army. Is also one of the book's keywords and is found in the title compounded with boy, Sozaboy. The Italian translation features an explicit and specific translation, soldati, un governo di sozza soldati e di polizia. As the glossary was included in the Italian edition as well, the word soza could have been maintained along with the estrangement it creates. The word soza soldati sounds artificial and unnatural, whereas in the original text, the word soza flows along beautifully in the narration, as would, I believe, a translation along these lines with the support of the glossary at the end of the book. I think we could also say in Italian, e perché il malgoverno vecchio era morto e adesso c'era un governo nuovo di sosa e di polizia, un governo dell'esercito e della polizia. Translating this novel by Saro-Wiwa means avoiding the deforming tendency of ridiculing the foreign, particularly with hypercorrectness and contrived phrasings. Ken Saro-Wiwa bends the English language in order to tell other stories, the stories which are a direct consequence of the empire's violence. The English language bends under the weight of another history, as Achebe said, Chinua Achebe. Sozaboy's language places itself exactly in the inter described by Bhabha. The narrator, Mene, speaks a language which is no longer his native one, and at the same time is not yet English. It is something in between. He tells us his story in a language which preserves the memory of origin, of a culture that fell under the blows of colonization, and expresses all the mystery and surprise of the arrival in a strongly estranging elsewhere. Sozaboy's language inhabits the interstice. Let us now examine a passage from Jean Rhys' postcolonial classic, Wide Sargasso Sea, published in 1966. Rhys' novel is set in Jamaica after the abolition of slavery. Underline the seemingly trivial argument we can see in the following example. We're going to read it now. The argument between 2 little girls, Antoinette and Tia. The former convinced her underwater somersault was successful, and the latter denying it. Underlying this seemingly trivial argument is a much stronger grudge. Antoinette comes from a family of rich landowners and was educated in the best schools, as demonstrated by the propriety of her language in describing the somersault episode. Tia is the daughter of a friend of Antoinette's nanny, coming from Martinique. The little girl's friendship is undermined by their racial and social differences. Therefore, the following example will enable us to further develop this aspect of the postcolonial discourse, and this is example number 4. But after one somersault, I still turned and came up choking. Tia laughed and told me that it certainly looked like I drowned at that time. Then she picked up the money. I did do it, I said when I could speak, but she shook her head. I hadn't done it good, and besides, pennies didn't buy much. Why did I look at her like that? Keep them then, you cheating nigger, I said, for I was tired, and the water I had swallowed made me feel sick. I can get more if I want to. That's not what she hear, she said. She hear all we poor light beggar. We ate salt fish, no money for fresh fish. That old house so leaky, you run with calabash to catch water when it rain. Plenty white people in Jamaica, real white people, they got called money. They didn't look at us. Nobody see them come near us. Old-time white people, nothing but white nigger now, and black nigger better than white nigger. Jean Rhys triggers off their resentment on the linguistic level by resorting to the code switch technique. Antoinette speaks standard literary English, while Tia speaks one of the many creole continuum varieties. That is the contact language of the Caribbean basin, that it is usually called creole continuum. As soon as Antoinette verbally assaults Tia, Rhys switches to the latter and makes her enter the narration with authority and no go-between. Indeed, Rhys does not mark Tia's lines with inverted commas. That old house so leaky, you ran with calabash to catch water when it rained, and shifts without a break from indirect speech to direct speech. Tia laughed and told me that it certainly looked like I drowned at that time. That's not what she hear, she said. She hear all we poor like beggar. The point of view is always Antoinette's, but Antoinette's identity is blurred, because even though she's the one referring Tia's words, she introduces them into her tale as if they were direct speech, not in the indirect speech. The effect is an unusual blend of one girl's words with the others, and Rhys surprises the reader time and again, making it difficult to tell between one girl and the other. They didn't look at us, nobody see them come near us. Rhys makes do with a handful of expedient to mark Tia's language and set it apart from Antoinette's standard English, in order to differentiate it and give it a purely oral feel. Rhys sets Tia's language in an area along the Creole continuum, featuring many points in common with the acrolect. Rhys simply avoids inflecting verbs, it certainly look like, conjugating the verbs in the past, I drowned, she drowned that time, by leaving out the copula of the nominal predicate, that old house so leaky. Therefore, it is important not to go overboard in the Italian rendering of T.'s variety of English. It is sufficient to make sparing use of a few deviations from standard Italian, conveying the oral feel of her speech. If we look at the Italian translation, this is what we see. Ma dopo una capriola mi girai ancora e tornai a galla mezzo soffocata. Tia scoppiò a ridere e mi disse che stavolta pareva proprio che morissi affogata. Poi si prese le monete. La capriola l'ho fatta, dissi quando potei parlare, ma lei scosse la testa. Non l'avevo fatta bene e del resto, coi pennies, si comprava ben poco. Perché la guardavo in quel modo? E allora tienteli, imbrogliona di una negra, dissi, perché ero stanca e l'acqua che avevo bevuta mi faceva star male. Posso averne quanti ne voglio se mi va. A lei non l'hanno raccontata così, ribatté. A lei hanno raccontato che siamo tutti poveri come pezzenti. Mangiamo pesce salato, non possiamo comprare pesce fresco. Quella vecchia casa tutta crepe, quando piove voi correte con le calabash a raccogliere l'acqua. Ci sono moltissimi bianchi in Giamaica, veri bianchi e pieni di soldi. Non ci guardavano nemmeno quelli, nessuno li vede mai avvicinarsi a noi. I bianchi di un tempo, nient'altro che negri bianchi adesso, e i negri neri meglio dei negri bianchi. The first thing to point out is that in the Italian translation, quotation marks and dashes are used where Rhys does not use them. The dialogue lines open and close with dashes, and Thiers' eruption into Antoinette's narration has been standardized with quotation marks so that it is very clear who is speaking. The order imposed on Rhys' novel provides for two distinct typography rules. But this usage of quotation marks and dashes creates order and it classifies, whereas in Rhys' novel, the diatopic varieties tend to lose their order and to overlap, to blend. In the Italian edition, Antoinette's and Thiers' identities are clearly distinct, whereas in Rhys' novel, they blend and originate Antoinette's unfocused identity. Hence, the appropriating rewriting of the Italian edition manipulates and distorts the Italian reader's perception of Antoinette's identity. As far as the translation is concerned, in the Italian edition, the translation of the first of Rhys' two linguistic levels of the English of the mother country is excellent. Here too, Antoinette tells her story naturally and self-assuredly using literary language. What is missing from the translation is the code switch each time Tia speaks. Here the language is standardized. In the second sentence, for instance, it would be estranging for the Italian reader as much as it is for the English reader to find Tia rise e disse che quella volta sembrava proprio che m'affogavo. The spoken language offers plenty of syntactic markers the translator can use to highlight the difference between Tia's language and Antoinette's. It is, in fact, in the spoken language, in the oral language, that we find the greater part of deviations from the standard use typical of the written language. The use of the indicative mood, in my suggestion, quella volta sembrava proprio che m'affogavo, instead of the subjunctive mood, is one of the main deviations from standard Italian found in spoken Italian, and is effective in highlighting the decidedly oral feel of this sentence as well as its difference with the standard Italian found in the first part. Instead, the Italian edition is characterized by appropriating, rewriting, wherein only tidiness, order, and propriety of the written language are emphasized. Once again, the victim is the liminal space and all its immense creative potential. Violating the hybrid space is to deny the foreign and to impede the birth of the new. Liminal space is present in Rushdie's Midnight's Children, published in 1981, right from the title. The midnight, the mid in midnight, runs through the entire novel in one form or the other, hanging mid-air, middle of my mother, in the middle of Mr. Methwold Sahib's long past, in the midst of the teeming multitudes, in the midst of the age of darkness. We have plenty of this use of mid something. Up to the summoning of those middles, which should be the main theme of the middle chapter, but which the writer mockingly pushes into the background already in the title, since this middle passage is called Alpha and Omega. Liminal space is especially abundant in the two phrases in a strange middle ground and into the middle place. Middle ground, middle place, found right at the beginning of the novel, in the very first pages. The concept of in-betweenness is hammered home twice and just a few lines apart, and it serves as the nail driven into the wall from which the hanged man of Chekhovian memory will swing. How then can the translator not take into consideration the ever-present inter that catapults us in medias res, as it were? What can be done to not to raise it, not to trivialize it, not to usurp its centrality? In fact, what happens in the Italian translation is that appropriating rewriting immediately takes root, and the two phrases middle ground and middle place are rendered with just one translatant, terra di nessuno, nobody's land. A translator that in fact reverses the position of that middle ground and of that middle place. Indeed, the translators or the revisers' mental grammar tends rashly to see that middle ground as a ground that belongs to nobody, and not instead as the in-between in which source and target cultures melt and generate a culture underway. The basic misinterpretation leads to the altered perception one has of the Italian version. The ground of Midnight's Children is presented as a strana terra di nessuno, a strange no man's land, and not as the ground of one and the other, or given the heavily composite cultural fabric of Rushdie's novel, as a singular land of many, everyone's land. And it is on the basis of this strange middle ground that I would like to consider the Italian edition of Midnight's Children, but just limited to a couple of examples because I think I'm running out of time. In Imaginary Homelands, Rushdie clearly states what type of language must be used in postcolonial novels. He says, we can't simply use the language of the way in the way the British did. It needs remaking for our own purposes. So he uses a sort of multivalent English, as Vishnupriya Ghosh says. Spearheaded this multivalent English, spearheaded then the English language of the Indian novel. It takes from the English varieties and vernaculars, the local Englishes, which are the flesh and blood of the English language, post-colonial fiction. His use of English, Rushdie's use of English, has always been postmodern, a sort of a situated hybrid English that escapes all purity or universality. Where Rushdie's assertiveness merges with his creative flair, juicy hybrid fruits spring out, such as those in our last example. He writes all these writing shiting, beauties, with her down to earthery, at the age of nearly 9, one word, on these Padmaless nights. Amina Sinai was reduced to glass kissery, and the final Ganesh nosed as I am. Unfortunately, the Italian edition rationalizes the lot with tutto quello scrivere, mirabile, con I suoi piedi per terra, a quasi 9 anni, in queste notti senza Padma, Amina Sinai era ormai ridotta ai baci sul vetro, con questo mio naso da Ganesh. Absolutely correct, but correct only as far as the sense, the meaning are concerned. The form is different. The form has been rationalized. But in the Kingpin middle episode of the novel, Alpha and Omega, there is a statement by the protagonist, Salem Sinai, which should have branded itself in the minds of the ones in charge of the Italian version of the novel. There is no escape from form. Such a powerful declaration should encourage one to make a conjecture and reckon that the text's dominant, that is the focus of the text to be translated, is to be found, as the writer, through his narrator, explicitly tells us, on an expressive level and not just on a semantic and informative one. Instead, this does not happen, and the Italian edition dulls Rushdie's creative peaks and turns them into trivial, predictable words and sentences. Building on this, I wonder what you would say if, for the previously mentioned phrases, I suggested tutta quella scrittura mirdura, colmo di beltà, or colmo di beltade, or belloso, because I think there is room for both interpretations and rendering, and we can talk about it later. Con la sua terra-territà, a quasi 9, one word, anni d'età, and of course the spell checker split quasi 9, the second I typed it, and kept warning me of the anomaly with that irritating squiggly red line. Notti apadmiche, with a privative A, era ormai ridotta al baciume su vetro, and the final Ganesh nasuto come sono. At this point, one can observe that where Rushdie's linguistic creations are clearly marked or appear in specific contexts, the Italian edition accepts them in all their deviating opulence. But where the author's creativity impertinently rears the head in a standard English sentence, mocking order, upsetting syntactic propriety, and championing disorder and contamination, the Italian edition hurriedly cures the infection so that it cannot spread, allow disorder to triumph, or permit insanity to thrive throughout the text's body. To conclude, exploring the inter means to actively investigate all the possibilities of receiving the foreign as such, as Antoine Berman would say, thus fulfilling the ethical aim of the translating act, receiving the foreign as such. The language of post-colonial authors is a receptacle of their history and of the violence inflicted by history on language. It is their way to signal their difference and hybridity, and the difference and hybridity of their in-between culture. When translators work on this kind of text, they should, I think, focus their attention not on the original or the copy, not on the source or the delta estuary, but on what lies in the midway. The hybrid journey of the translation act in perennial migration between the memory of the origin and, as in Giorgio de Chirico's painting, the enigma of the arrival. Thank you.
Thank you, Franca. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. It was so rich and thought-provoking. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. Federico has been very active during your talk with a few observations, but do please, everyone, do share your questions in the chat. While questions are coming in, I wonder if I could perhaps begin, Franca, by asking you then about your focus on the Italian situation and these lovely examples that you've given us. Would you want to argue then that Italian, the kind of the norm in Italian translation has been it's been a particular problem for Italian translators, that in general Italian translators have been perhaps less adventurous or less respectful or more conservative? Would you want to argue then that other translation cultures deal with this kind of problem better?
I really don't know whether other countries deal better with this problem. I can only speak as far as the Italian situation is concerned. You may find many young and less younger translators who are willing to explore the inter in these terms, who are willing to be innovative, especially if the writer is innovative in his novel, in their novel or short stories. But the point is that there's a kind of self-censorship. Since you are you think that the publisher will not accept it, instead of being bold and be daring and try anyway, since you think this is the best thing to do, to translate a hybrid language, a hybrid English language with a hybrid Italian language. Many people just are self-effacing. They are they just impose to themselves this self-censorship. The point is that publishers in Italy, most publishers in Italy, are very normative. They are very normative. What I said at the very beginning, they want una bella traduzione, and what they mean by that the Italian has to be standard literary Italian. It has to be as it's always used to be. And those translators who want to translate in a different way find many difficulties in having their translations accepted. I don't know how it is in other traditions, literary traditions in other countries.
Thank you. We've a number of questions coming in the chat. Thank you to those of you who have committed already. Carol asked, I wonder what the solution would be if the postcolonial text is to be translated back into the native language. That's an interesting question.
Yes. Well, we may talk a lot about it. But what do you mean by a native language? The writer's native language, that's what you mean?
I presume the question is about, well, what if you then back translated back into the original language, although that's perhaps a speculative example.
Yes, in Saro-Wiwa's Ogoni, for example, as far as Nigerian writers are translated in their native language, I don't know. What I find interesting here is that, for example, in Sozaboy, the Saro-Wiwa's native language, that is Ogoni, pushes from beneath and alters the apparently English surface of the language. That's what the way African writers write, and I find it very interesting. In Italy, we experiment this with vernaculars. We have many authors who just have their original vernacular pushing from beneath and altering and moving the surface of Italian. So you have a contaminated Italian contaminated with their vernaculars. So it's very original. It's very rich. And we still don't have this kind of hybrid language with African languages, because it is immigration from Africa in Italy is still a very recent phenomenon. But I'm really waiting for these hybrid texts to be present on the Italian market as well. Yes.
Perhaps following on from that, a question from Michaela. Would perhaps a translator whose native language is not Italian perhaps be a more suitable candidate as a translator for such issues of preserving the foreignness in texts and preserving that liminal space?
I don't know. It depends probably. I think it could be a good idea as far as real broken English is concerned. Meaning by broken English, a language spoken by someone whose mother tongue is not English, and who has studied English just for a few years and therefore doesn't properly speak English. In this case, broken English, because broken English can also be used to define pidgin, which, as I said at the very beginning, it's a new language, is another language, and it's not broken English. It's something which has come out from a few African languages, for example, in Africa, and English, or from few African languages and French or Spanish in other countries different from Nigeria, since the example was taken from Nigeria. So if we had a whole novel written in broken English, and we had a translator translating, for example, from Italian into someone whose mother tongue is English, translating into Italian, then probably we would have really authentic examples of mistakes and so on. But here the situation is very complicated because we have three kinds of, three linguistic levels, as Saro-Wiwa explains in his introduction. We have Nigerian Pidgin English, which is a new language. We have broken English because Mene doesn't speak English very well because he has only studied it for a few years. And so he makes many mistakes, and that's a different level. And then, of course, he remembers idiomatic expressions very well, and he is perfect when he uses those idiomatic expressions. And it's very amusing because maybe they are very ancient idiomatic languages. So you have various different registers. And I think that since you're translating this into Italian, you have to master properly the whole range of Italian to be able to see. You have to look for the proper idiomatic expressions in Italian. You have to make mistakes in Italian, and everybody can remember the kind of mistakes we made while we were in primary school and we were learning Italian. That would be enough. Mene is not so old, he's still a teenager, so his boyhood is still not so far away. And then, as far as the ranging of Nigerian Pidgin English, what I suggest is to, since it's an oral language, we have only very few novels and short stories so far with sections in Nigerian Pidgin English. Chinua Achebe began, and his Antilles of the Savannah, I think was published in 1998. Now I don't remember exactly, but anyway, it's not so far away. And to know what are the main differences in oral Italian as opposed to written Italian, to literary Italian, then you have to master your own mother tongue very well. So I don't know whether all this could be rendered by someone whose mother tongue is not Italian.
And I'm reading Jhumpa Lahiri at the moment and thinking that, you know, there are so many different degrees of non-native use of a language, and somebody like her, I'm sure, would be able, on the one hand, to grasp the essential foreignness at the same time as writing by now effectively as a native. There are a couple of questions around a slightly different issue, following on from your critiques of some of these Italian translations, and that's the question of whether this is a rationale for retranslations. So Letitia says, many thanks for this fascinating talk. I have two questions. Is there any room for retranslations of those post-colonial classics? And Michaela also with a follow-up question asking about retranslations and publishing rights. Can one make a case for newer translations being needed if the examples are as you say?
In both cases, I would say in Rushdie's as well, I don't think a new translation would be necessary, a retranslation. A good revision would be necessary. Because, for example, in the case of Wide Sargasso Sea, all the sections in the novel where Antoinette tells a story, which is told, narrated in a perfect English, in a perfect literary English language. The translation is excellent. Adriana Motti's translation is excellent. She was absolutely one of our best translators. She was a model for me. The point is that when the translation was, when she did that translation, Wide Sargasso Sea, Il Grande Mare dei Sargassi, nobody knew anything about contact languages in Italy. They didn't know about pidgins. They didn't know about creoles. They didn't know such thing as a creole continuum. All these shades of creole, where you, with no solution of continuity, you pass from one shade to the next shade, and then going down along the continuum. So she, and probably in the publishing house as well, they thought just of someone who tried to speak English and couldn't do that. They didn't think of something so new as a contact language. So more than half of the novel is perfectly translated. One could only do something, revise TS language and try to be more expressive and having more regard for this hybridity in TS language, and above all, trying in the Italian translation as well, in the Italian version, try to blend, to have the two varieties of language melt and overlap, and not to have them so distinct. This is when the one speaks, this is when the other one, the other girl speaks. No, it's fantastic what she does. I mean, every time when I read it, I'm really touched and really moved by, there's no one word about what she feels, but she expresses it so beautifully, what she feels, when she talks to Tia Antoinette. So I think I think that there's, I don't know how it is in the UK and in the English speaking world in general, but there's really a commonplace in Italy. Many editors, many publishers say that after 20 years, a translation is old and needs to be, it's the same in the UK. I think this is, just take a book of any translation dating back to the year 2000. How can we find that language so old and incomprehensible? It's not true, I think. If you have to retranslate something, it's because it's the translation, even in the year 2000, could have been done better and could have been revised better in the publishing house, but not because 20 years have elapsed. So very often just a good revision taking into account all these aspects could be enough.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned publishers in your response then, and indeed in your presentation. And there's a question from Barbara. Do you see this situation in Italy with publishers' preferences for tidy texts changing? And if so, who will lead that change? Academics, readers, translators? Are there indie publishers in Italy similar to e.g. Charco and Fitzcarraldo in the UK who might champion a change?
I don't think that academics are leading it in Italy. I think that most translators, mostly translators and revisers who have a solid academic background can lead it because they have grasped the point while they were at the university in their studies, and now by translating and revising these works of these novels, these short stories, they try to apply it to the act of translating. But publishers do not listen to academics. They don't even read them, most publishers. So it's just if you, maybe it's enough when you have one editor or two editors in a publisher house to really affect the situation and try to change it. And one or two translators for each working for each publishing house. That's the way my generation started when we began 30 years ago. That's what we tried to explain to editors, why we didn't want to follow their policy. And they say, you make me laugh. And I said, well, let's see who will laugh later. And then they have changed. I remember when I insisted on not saying always negro for black, because they think that Italian colonialism had a human face, was better than other colonialisms, and so on. And that's not true. That's what they tell them. But little by little, even very conservative publishers have begun not to say negro anymore and say nero. So they just have to take their time, but it's mainly, I think, translators, revisers, and editors who are familiar with these questions who lead the innovation.
Thank you. A question from Beatrice on a slightly different topic then, from the translator's point of view. And Beatrice asks, well, thank you for this inspiring presentation, she says. Should the translator inform the reader about the syntactic and grammatical peculiarities of the source text preserved in the target text, or would that spoil the effect?
I think that a good idea would be to have 3, 4, 5 pages at the end, a sort of afterword by the translator. If it is very innovative, I think it's better to have this afterward and explain it. I wouldn't say not just for the readers, but for reviewers as well. Because otherwise they just criticize and they say something unpleasant because they didn't grasp what the problem was and what the translator did, And so it's a very good idea. I always encourage my students to do that, especially at the very beginning, when they are beginning, because their contractual power is less than an expert translator, and so it's a good thing, I think, to see that it's every mistake, something which can be seen as a mistake, is a conscious mistake, and is not really a mistake. It's something which is very normal in oral Italian, but if it's normal in oral Italian, why can't I write it in a dialogue, which simulates orality, a dialogue? Or if I have, as in the case of Sozaboy, a young man telling the story in his own words. It would be very, it would be, I think, oh, it's very, I think I need a light now. Sorry, I didn't realize that it was so, okay, maybe like that, it's better. Okay, sorry about that, I just saw it now. It is complicated. Just to leave it without writing about it at the end of the book, if the innovation is really important. I would suggest that, yes.
I was interested when you mentioned that the Italian translation of Sozaboy has a glossary at the back, which suggests that enough of the foreignisms of Saro-Wiwa's writing are retained in the Italian for that to be helpful.
Yes, but nevertheless, we can see it in, I think, in the third example, when I concentrated only on the question of Sosa Soldati, saying it's included in the glossary, both in the English edition and the Italian edition. So it was not necessary to say Sosa Soldati. It's just the government of Sosa and police, un governo di Sosa e polizia. But in the glossary, Nakintori is also included, and it says gossip or chatting. So sometimes one is prevailing on the other. So you have this. It is explained in the glossary. Nevertheless, in the Italian translation, you have mangiavano un sacco di mais con le pere snocciolando racconti. Snocciolare racconti, what does it mean? It is gossiping or chatting simply, no? Spettegolando or chiacchierando under the moon. So it is as if people who have revised the translation just didn't even have a look at the glossary. They work in separate compartments. That's the problem. And it's not a problem of the translator. It's a problem of the publisher. There must be someone inside the publishing house who is responsible for the whole work, who at the very end checks everything and sees that it is consistent and not, can I say, compartmentalized? Yes, okay. But that's what happens, unfortunately. And it's the publisher's responsibility, not the translators.
Our time is nearly up, but I wonder if we could just squeeze in one last question from Sean Evans, who broadens out really from your examples and asks, how do we approach translating regional dialects? It's a very big question. It's been a tradition, Sean says, to translate someone like the Quebec playwright Tremblay, who wrote in Joual, into Glaswegian, for example. The cultures are very different, but there's some overlap, both spoken by the urban working class. Is there another way? Asks Sean. It's a very big question, so you may
yes,
be
it is. Antoine Bermond, who used to translate from Spanish American into French, for him, this deforming tendency was the last one he mentioned. It is very, very difficult when you have varieties of the same language in the same text. And I think it is more clear to me what I don't do. I won't use Neapolitan or the vernacular spoken in Rome or in Bologna or in Milan, for that matter, to translate a variety of English coming not from England. And I wouldn't use the italics, just translate into standard Italian and use the italics. What does it mean? It's just anyway standard Italian. I wouldn't invent, as sometimes some editors ask my former students, they ask me to just invent a language. It's something so spontaneous, so natural in the original text, and then you have to construct something in Italian. Just to give you one example, I have translated David Malouf from Australian English, and for example, he uses river and he uses, of course, creek. Sometimes river, sometimes creek. And the creek is as large as a river, is not something very thin. If I have, and if there's no name for this river, this creek, because otherwise I would leave a yellow river or a red creek, and I would leave it in English with capital letters. But if just he says river in one case and then creek in another, if creek, for example, if it's a kind of dating, a young man and a young girl deciding to meet near the river on the bridge, and he asks, I will see you, ti aspetto sulle spalle del Rio. Instead of using fiume, I would use Rio, which has nothing regional. It is just, or maybe, yes, Venice, but it's more a question of a changing of register. And it may be very poetic, Rio short for fiume. But in this case, it would be a little bit ironic. So in Italian, I wouldn't have the same translated for two different words, fiume, river and creek, both translated as fiume, But for one, I would have fiume for river, which is the most commonly used word for river, fiume, and for creek, rio. But in this case, it could go. In another case, it would be absolutely out of place. So I think what I try to do is, if it's different from standard English, I always try to look for words which are not so immediately recognizable as standard Italian. Mm-hmm. It's the only thing I think I can try to do. But I would never use, and I have never used, diatopic varieties, Italian diatopic varieties for Anglophone diatopic varieties.
Thank you for giving us examples from your own practice at the end there. We are out of time, I'm afraid. You've lost the light, and we come to the end of our time. And thank you so much again for your wonderful presentation and for the generosity of your answers. Before we close, can I just remind our audience that we have another in the series next week. Our next research seminar will be given by Jacob Blakesley from Leeds, and we're kind of continuing the Italian theme in the sense that Jacob will be speaking on global translations of Dante's Divine Comedy from the Renaissance until today. And there are two other research seminars in the BCLT series later in the term, and details of all of the remaining research seminars are available via the BCLT website and can be booked indeed already. So thank you all, our audience. Thank you for your questions.
May I join you, Duncan? Sorry, just to say thank you, Duncan, and thank you everybody for participating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franca, once again. Thank you from all of us for launching our BCLT Research Seminar series with such a splendid presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.